Okay, so hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming across time zones, both too early and too late, maybe some people just right. Nick and I had conceived of this event before the era of COVID, when we had imagined that everyone would gather in person to reflect on each other's text, perhaps in a more informal fashion. But now we open up a new distribution of spaces, linking us all from our respective places. And so the theme of this event, as you know, is the therapeutic politics of care, broadly rich, across spaces intimate, as well as institutional forms, and across the microscopic scale, as well as cosmic and karmic scales. So we begin with the premise that the drive to care is far from innocent, but also leaves us in the wake of its conundrums. So we invite you to use this as a chance to reflect, to listen, to read with us and reread with us in these difficult times, across our times and spaces. So I turn it over to Nick.
Thanks, Emily. Okay, so I'm going to do a brief introduction of our panelists. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you to Sydney and Athena and to the Weatherhead East Asia Institute here at Columbia and our other sponsors for putting together this event. So I'm going to introduce our panelists in the order that we'll be speaking. And Felicity, our first panelist, will be speaking first, but also last. So Felicity Elino is assistant professor in the anthropology department at UMass Amherst. Her book, which came out in 2019 from Cornell University Press, is Rituals of Care, Karmic Politics in an Aging Thailand. Ting Lyle, a recent graduate from Cornell University and about to be assistant professor at Yale and US, has recently finished a dissertation at Cornell, which title is Colonial Wounds, Development and the Politics of Affliction on the China-Burma Border. My name is Nicholas Bartlett, or Nick. I'm assistant professor in Asian and Middle Eastern cultures here at Barnard in Columbia. I'm the author of Recovering Histories, Life and Labor After Heroin in Reform Era China. I don't know why I had to look down to remember that, hopefully. And that's from California Press. Saiba Varma is assistant professor in the anthropology department at UC San Diego. And she's the author of The Occupied Clinic, Militarism and Care in Kashmir, which came out this year from Duke University Press. Lyle Fernley is assistant professor of anthropology at the Singapore University of Technology and Design. And he's the author of Virulent Zones, Animal Disease and Global Health at China's Pandemic Epicenter, which came out, I believe, last month from Duke University Press. And finally, Emily Ung is postdoctoral fellow on the Rural Imaginations Project at the Amsterdam School of Cultural Analysis at the University of Amsterdam. And she is the author of A Time of Lost Gods, Mediumship, Madness, and the Ghost After Mao, which came out from University of California Press. So briefly to review the format, each author will provide a reading, I guess except for Felicity, well, you'll see how. Each author will provide a reading of one's own of the other author's text, and then revisit and describe their own work in light of the resonances and dissonances that arise. So we'll have 15 minutes each, with 5 minutes or so reflecting on the previous person's work, and then 10 or so on their own. And I guess Felicity will start with her own and come back to talk about it. So on that note, let me turn it over to Felicity.
All right, so thank you. And let me say again, pandemia, like who can think right now? What are we all doing? And it's just such a gift to be here with you. It's a gift ever to have anyone read your work. It's a gift to have people come and listen. So I feel very, very thankful. And I guess my goal for us today is just to be loose, stay loose, and to appreciate some of the pieces of these really, really gorgeous books. Okay, so I'm going to spend a few minutes awkwardly to start on my own. And then we'll set off this chain of thinking about, with, and through one another's work. So I'll be back at the end with Emily's new book. So my rituals of rituals of care, it's based on work primarily in northern Thailand. And it starts at bedsides, people caring at home for bedridden elders. And then it moves on to care as practiced in more general ways, care for one's group, care for the nation. And to get a sense of this care, what's happening, the registers of care here, I start with a really broad definition. just care simply as providing for others. And then in that way, you have to understand what counts, for whom, in context, what people do, what they pay attention to. And that led me to put forward a new form of critical phenomenology, where I define it as the social training of awareness and the lived experience that stems from such habituated attention to the world. And to do this, I had to get over some post-Protestant Reformation baggage in my own conditioning, including in the conceptual landscape of the medical and social sciences. And I found that certain Asian philosophical lineages, like Theravadan Abhidhammic theory of mind, certain Chinese ritual theory, to be really, really instructive, helpful to attune to what Thai social worlds were propagating and how. And so in essence, I want to put forward the notion that care is a really powerful lens, a really powerful object of study. It led me to argue that social, political, and religious structures are embodied in habituated ways of providing for others in care. But as we've started, it's not a rosy picture. All the books in this collection are showing that values and other social constructs like hierarchy are trained in perception through repetition and social dictates, so forth. So what one is forced to pay attention to by social worlds is basically naturalized in perception as reality. So much so that people feel cared for and care for others through practices that simultaneously ensnare, oppress, and otherwise do violence. So care is not always a good thing from every vantage point, and I think that's what we're about to get into. So without further ado, I want to introduce Lyle Ting, who wrote an incredible dissertation at Cornell, as we've heard, Colonial Development and the Politics of Affliction on the China-Myanmar Border. We just read parts of this in my global health class, and it's truly powerful. And she's now joining us, as Nick mentioned, from Singapore. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Felicity, for that beautiful opening and caring opening in a non-violent way. So I'm just going to do the conventional anthropology reading from the text, and I apologize. And let me begin with some thank you notes. So thank you to the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University for hosting us, as well as to other sponsors, and Nick and Emily for organizing this panel, and my fellow panelists for sharing. So now I'm going to have the honor to reflect on Felicity's Rituals of Care, which you have just heard directly from the author herself. My presentation begins with some of my thoughts on the major contributions on Felicity Elino's Rituals of Care. I would then briefly introduce my own project, and then finally close with some ideas and questions that Felicity's research has provoked me to think more deeply about in my own work. So now I'm going to share a screen. Let me begin by sharing some thoughts on Felicity Elino's Rituals of Care. As elsewhere in the world, many countries in Asia are facing what economists have dubbed a demographic time bomb. With low birth rates and fast aging populations, these countries are facing the challenges of a shrinking workforce, rising pension demands, and increasing old age dependency. Rituals of Care invites us to examine the everyday realities underpinning these broader demographic and socioeconomic trends. Following family caregivers, volunteers, healthcare workers, and the elderly themselves, Aulino carefully discusses the intimate and habituated practices of care in Thailand. She illustrates how indigenous theories of the mind, self, and morality shape quotidian actions of care, and how these theories and actions in turn delimit political possibilities for change. This moving and powerful ethnography inspires new ways for thinking about the body, the political, and the religious. I will focus on 4 aspects in particular. First, the interrelations between religious ideologies and practices of care. Second, the relationships between the social and the individual body. Third, the dialectics between violence and care. And fourth, the connection between the personal and the political. I will discuss each of these themes in turn. First, Aulino's work highlights the interrelations between religious ideologies and practices of care. Dominant Western ideologies of care tend to emphasize the importance of sincerity and authenticity. But as Aulino reminds us, this emphasis on intention and inner motivation is founded on Euro-American and Christian ideas about self and morality, as Aulino just mentioned just now. She shows how for many people in Thailand, their practices of care are grounded in Buddhist philosophies and theories of the mind. Intention, while important, is not the central focus. Showing up and providing for others are ritual acts that matter in themselves. Western ideas of care might focus on the authentic desire to help, but in the Thai context, actions do not have to be in line with motivation and intention for them to matter and to be effective. Acts of care, regardless of motivation, have effects in the world. From a karmic perspective, they in fact matter and have effects beyond this lifetime. Second, Aulino carefully draws the connection between the individual and the social. She creatively considers these interconnections through the notion of the social body. Scholars of Thailand have examined Thai group dynamics through the concept of face. Moving beyond these discussions about the symbolism and metaphoric significance of face, Aulino shows the lived experience of group dynamics. Many people in Thailand are habituated to consider themselves as part of a collective. The health and harmony of the social body is trained to be intrinsically connected to the health and harmony of the individual body. This directly relates to my third point about Aulino's contribution, which is the relationship between violence and care. As Aulino writes, while people in Thailand respect the harmony of the social body is also deeply hierarchical. Care also perpetuates structural violence by reinscribing hierarchies that maintain status quos that benefit elites. The concept of pity, for example, establishes the hierarchy between the person receiving care and the person giving care. Furthermore, care in Thailand follows a patronage culture that stresses the rank and generosity of the giving person. But as Aulino cautious against understanding Thai practices of care as merely false consciousness that reproduces structural inequalities. She highlights how within patterns of domination also lies creative possibilities for using old ways in new forms. In Aulino's words, caregiving remains a practice that demands compromise, that binds people even as it sets them free. Ultimately, rituals of care is an intricate theorization of the connection between the personal and the political. Aulino proposes that political change requires reconfiguration in the realm of the personal, in particular in the realm of the habituated activity. This intervention joins Black, Indigenous, feminist, and queer theories to push back against status ideas about power and politics. Power is not always top-down or coherent. It is localized, intimate, and lived. Power is entwined in networks of care, labor, affect, and love. And as such, it is fragmented, distributed, and dispersed. Changes in the way we pay attention, in how we relate to each other, and in how we think about hierarchies of care are seeds for political and structural shifts. This understanding of power and political change compels us to consider the specificities of the political as it plays out in intimate everyday encounters and cautions against oversimplistic impositions of progressive Western ideologies. For example, in the Thai case that Aulino writes about, because care circulates in Thailand through a patronage system, the imposition of supposedly egalitarian rights-based systems of care actually disrupts the social body and stirs new problems. Aulino's Rituals of Care honors frontline care workers who grapple every day with the needs of the elderly and the dying. For the people she writes about, the demographic crisis is not a looming problem in the future, not a ticking time bomb about to be set off. The crisis has already arrived. The people she writes about are already living the crisis, already having to cope in the meantime. As they navigate this crisis in their everyday practices of care, these frontline workers shape not only their personal and social karmic stories, but the trajectories of Thai society and Asia more broadly. Rituals of Care has been inspirational for me to think through my own work on affliction and development among minoritized indigenous people. Like Aulino's work, I'm also interested in the relationship between intimate everyday experiences and political projects. Let me now share my own project briefly here before I continue to talk more about how Rituals of Care is pushing me to think about my own work. My book in progress examines the rise of affliction among the Lisu people in the context of rapid development. It builds on a decade of engagement and 2 years of continuous fieldwork with Lisu subsistence farmers in the New River Valley on the China-Myanmar border. The Lisu are a transnational indigenous community living dispersed across the borders of China, Myanmar, Thailand, and India. In the New River Valley, a region within the borders of the Chinese state, the Lisu constitute the majority. Rapid Chinese development has massively reduced absolute poverty. However, like many indigenous communities elsewhere, Lisu continue to struggle with high rates of alcoholism, mental illness, and violence. My work asks, why, despite rapid economic development, are indigenous communities like the Lisu still suffering from high and increasing rates of affliction, social despair, and precarity? Governments and public health experts often perceive these diseases as the side effects of successful development and the results of changing personal lifestyle due to increasing societal wealth. Contrary to these views, I propose understanding illness as the direct effects of development. The assault on Lisu bodies in the name of development, the systemic collapse of Lisu life worlds and value system, the breakdown of family and gender relations, and the rapid transition from subsistence to urban living all contribute to the deterioration of Lisu well-being. My analysis shows how afflictions are not merely symptoms of vulnerability, but also political acts through which Lisu refuse domination and generate alternative narratives, communities, and imaginations. In the final minutes of this presentation, I would like to share some questions that Aulino's work have raised for me vis-a-vis my own project. I focus on 4 questions that I am currently thinking through. How can Aulino's analysis of caregiving as performative ritual acts be extended to understand experiences of affliction also as performative acts? Like Aulino, I'm also persuaded to consider afflictions as forms of speech acts that have effects in the world. In other words, afflictions are not just biological diseases or symptoms of political and structural oppression, but are political acts that make social commentaries. Afflictions, like acts of care, do things. They can, as I write in my manuscript, remember, refuse, or critique. But if, as Aulino proposes, caregiving serves as a reproduction of hierarchy and a reinforcement of a particular cosmological understanding of time, self, and morality, can we understand affliction as a way of disturbing, unsettling, and questioning those hierarchies? In other words, is caregiving about enacting life worlds and afflictions about interrupting them? Second, phenomenological experience-centered analysis often focuses on the individual body. The social body is conceptualized in metaphoric and symbolic terms. How can anthropologists hone a phenomenological approach to the social body to highlight the social body as also lived, sensuous, habituated, and cultivated? Aulino's persuasively shows how the social body is embodied, trained, and emerging through practice. Reading Aulino, I'm inspired in my own analysis of affliction to connect individual experiences of affliction and illness to the ailments of the social body. Like people in Thailand, Lisu are also habituated to perceive themselves as part of a larger collective. This is reflected in Lisu myths, architecture, language, and group activities. Thinking through Aulino's conception of the social body inspires me to link individual Lisu experiences of pain, alcoholism, and madness to changes occurring in the social body, including cultural loss in the face of rapid change or forced relocation under urbanization campaigns. Rationalization projects that extract the individual body out of their social body does violence by disrupting people's habituated sense of collectivity. Lisu experiences of affliction are not thus simply individual struggles, but social and collective ones. Third, how do ideologies of time shape ideas about the body? For many Thai people, the responsibilities they face in this life are connected to karma accumulated in their past lives. Furthermore, their actions presently also have implications for future lives. This relationship with time stands in stark contrast to secular development time in which past, present, future are separate. Aulino's ethnography shows the ways in which people in their acts of care negotiate with multiple ideologies of time, including Buddhist karmic time, development time, slow phenomenological time. Her conception of the relationship between ideologies of time, caregiving practices, and suffering pushes me to consider how Lisu afflictions are also embedded within multiple ideologies and experiences of time. For example, while Chinese development discourses presume time to be linear and forward-moving, Lisu affliction forces the afflicted and their caregivers to linger. Sometimes the afflicted are physically unable to move forward in life. Often their pain and suffering compel them and their caregivers to remember the origins of their ailments. The body is thus always embedded within time and history, as the other authors on this panel also show. In particular, in Bartlett's analysis of how people recovering from heroin addiction experience time, in Ng's analysis of how mediumship connects people and events across time and place, in Varma's analysis of how ongoing historical violence unfolds within the clinic, and in Fernley's analysis of how the search for the pandemic origins always push outwards towards questions about cause and context. Last but not least, Aulino's work makes me wonder, where should political change begin? In the face of rising authoritarianism throughout Asia and across the world, what are the entry points for change and engagement? Aulino's work reminds us to hold on to hope, that, as she puts it, care is there to do, and what we do matters. Aulino's and my work share a common commitment to cultivating deeper understandings of the languages of the body. How does thinking about practices of care in Aulino's work and experiences of affliction in my own work as also political action push us to consider new ways of working with, caring for, and listening to each other? Our work underscores the high stakes involved for failing to pay attention to the links between intimate everyday practices and political structures of domination. Thank you. So I'm going to stop sharing now. And now I'm going to pass the microphone to Nick Bartlett, who will be discussing my work alongside his new book, Recovering Histories, Life and Labor After Heroin in Reform Era China.
Thank you so much, Ting. And that was such a beautiful reflection, and the way that you wove together your work with Felicity's, I am not going to reproduce, and I apologize. I love your piece, and I put it next to mine, but I did not do such a beautiful job of weaving. So with that said, let me talk a little bit about your work, which is fantastic. So for this, and here's what I'm going to read the first part, and then for my own stuff, for better or worse, I'm half winging it. So for this panel, I have the pleasure of reading Ting Lao's work for the first time. Ting is an extremely gifted ethnographer with a really incredible, compelling project. This dissertation, Colonial Development and the Politics of Affliction on the China-Myanmar Border, takes place in village Kusa, a Lisu indigenous community of approximately 40 households in the New River Valley. Life here is shaped by two colonial forces, Chinese development projects and a Christian movement that has converted the majority of local residents. So while the spectralization of the rural that Ting is talking about here is by no means unique to this part of China, the policies and reconfigurations of daily life associated with the country's reform and opening have had particularly devastating consequences for this group. The Lisu, Ting tells us, has the highest suicide rate among the 56 ethnic groups in China. Ting's dissertation focuses on an interrelated group of afflictions. So pain, alcohol dependency, and madness are connected in this really interesting, nuanced, I think very innovative way. And Ting argues they're fundamentally structured by the trauma associated with this ongoing colonization. I'd love to have a little bit more time to discuss her version of this sojourner anthropology that I think you make really interesting interventions in, as well as the notion of the Political Speech Act. But for the sake of time, I'm going to focus my comments a little bit more narrowly on Conjuring the Spirits, the Melancholic Refusal, which is a dissertation chapter turned into an article that's in progress that I've read. So this focuses on a vivid evening of collective drinking. Ting's account explores the complicated ways that leftover men, a group that includes widowed, divorced, never married Lisu elders, turn to alcohol as a response to an extreme form of marginalization. Embracing the stigmatizing label of alcohol drinking men, and in a way that I think in the sort of righteous Dopfine in a way was sort of echoing in my head as I was thinking. This group valorizes their own position by mocking and inverting the terms of their own exclusion. So rather than lazy, primitive, ungrateful, they argue they live in a life of autonomy, working when they choose. Their drinking is an occasion to make frequent jokes about the distorted expectation, work habits, and even superstitions that they attribute to Christian neighbors and Han Chinese workers. So I want to do two. Care actually isn't an explicit analytic in either of our work in the same way. I think that it's so central in Felicity. So I'm going to try to tease out care in the, at least that I saw, the forms that were offered. So in a first reading, I think what I see here is care might be understood as constituted through the bonds of brotherhood among this community of alcohol drinkers, characterized by a playfulness, reciprocity, and the shared disdain of other groups. Yet the drinking takes on additional meaning as the group descends into this alcohol madness, a state where consuming this local maize spirit, this hydra, leads to possession. And armed with a camera, Ting documents a growing pandemonium as Uncle Zoda and other drinkers call ancestor spirits and begin to act as corpses hanging from trees and as demons eager to create mischief. Ting argues that this form of drinking is part of a melancholic refusal. So she's joining Angela Garcia and others who reread Freud's Mourning and Melancholia to note that Uncle Zoda and these other drinkers reaffirm their attachment to the past through a form of ethical work. I really like this reading, but I actually think that you're doing something more too. And I think that I saw this co-present, but wanted to emphasize it. I was struck by the work that drinking does in this account. Perhaps in part, it's a work of culture. Obesikra is evoked in another part of the dissertation, and I think that is relevant. So the move to crystallize affects in a familiar, if neglected, symbolic system. But unlike the psychic work of keeping an open wound, this refusal, as you discuss in other parts of the dissertation, is meant to do things in the world. The drinkers howl, they wake up neighbors, they insist on having these pictures taken, they black out and their bodies are in places that disrupt. And a small note, Joshua Burrows, remembering to forget, I'll tell you later. There's interesting resonances, I think, with other people who've thought about blackout and existential forms. Importantly, in your account, Lisa's men experience of possession and their comment in everyday interaction are inflected by persecutory fantasies. So I'm struck, for example, in another chapter when you and Uncle Zoda are talking, and you're talking about a state project that might displace Lisu from their land. And he responds to this project that is trying to move Lisu into apartments. He says, the country really wants to kill us. And aggression, destruction, and murderous rage seem to move between self and others in complicated ways in your account. The refusal here then seems more than a commemoration of an internalized object, an idealized lost object. Part of the originality of your account, exceeding this melancholic frame, is the violent form of haunting associated with this cultural erasure. The particular return of the now menacing partial rituals, not completely reconstituted. Where was I? Sorry. And in particular, the bad death of Moby, an alcohol drinking man, re-enchant and haunt the new river valley in these really interesting ways. So the destruction and menacing visions that emerge from this playful drinking might be understood as a form of care that you put regenerates cultural life precisely by refusing to allow others, the Christians, the Han who are involved in these other projects, from having a full closure with this past. So part of your skill as a writer, I'd just like to conclude before moving to my stuff, is this work has a real haunting quality to it. And I found myself, since I first read this, I keep thinking about these figures and about this scene. And so I think it's just a testimony to your gifts as a writer and also to how compelling this project is. Okay, so now let me move to my project, which again, unfortunately is not interwoven in the same way. So I'm gonna start with a contrast and then 3 resonances. So my contrast with your project is you center intoxication, alcohol. And in my project, it's about addiction, but there's no heroin in the book, almost at all. And there was very little heroin, at least I was very rarely around heroin when I was in Goodyo. I worked in harm reduction before coming to this project. And so in other contexts, that wasn't necessarily the case. But this field work was a shift away from the presence of the drug. And I think that that's maybe a lack, but also made possible a different type of intervention. And let me, as an intro to the project, I'll say how I came to this place and why that happened. So I was working for a foundation at the time, part-time while I was in grad school, and I had grantees in Gyeongju, the city where this book takes place, who I was responsible for giving money to. So I was enmeshed in this collaboration where my first trip there, I literally came with plans and 6-month and 1-year outputs, and I was incredibly involved in a particular attention to certain futures, working with recovering drug users to create their own NGOs, these grassroots non-registered organizations. And so my attentiveness and how I became engaged in this community already was focused on a particular phenomenological orientation that I was a part of trying to create. And so I became very invested in that. And it led me to have certain types of relationships that were oriented in certain ways. So I think that only for this panel, I sort of realized how central that was. So the project is fundamentally about a critical phenomenological approach to recovery. And what does this mean in practice? A way in is to think of the contrast in Chinese between two terms. Quitting drugs is literally to, this is used by a lot of medical professionals, but also in common parlance, is to literally have one's body free of, in this case, heroin, opioids. A second, much more evocative term was 回归社会, to return to society. And when people talked about this term, it comes up a lot. And it's not just drug users. Falun Gong members, corrupt government officials, homeless youth are all told by the government, it's a message. You need to return to society. And part of what was so generative as I arrived in Gyeongju was to realize that people who are recovering from addiction, didn't know how to answer this question. And in fact, sometimes we're angry at being asked it. It evoked a complicated range of emotions to say, you need to return to society. And the question, one question was, to which vision of society, at what moment? And already past and future, 回归 in Chinese is return, Hong Kong returns to China. What does it mean to reincorporate into a social formation that is itself dynamically changing? So that was, I think, the way this formulation of the project emerged. I will be mindful of time when I go over. I start the book by making the argument that we need to understand this group as a generational cohort. And this means something in particular, not just like a drug use cohort in the way of like public health studies, but a Mannheimian cohort that shares a common orientation to problems and that is constituted historically. And so they were all born in the late 1960s and 1970s and came to use heroin in the 80s and 90s, late 80s and early 90s, almost all heroin users in Gyeongju during the same period, while they were entering the economy at a moment when private sector jobs were opening up and there was a tin mining boom. So this is in Yunnan, in an area where state-owned enterprises had been so central and they're being eviscerated at the same moment as the mountain opens up and this group is able to make a lot of money very quickly. And so almost all of them in their early career, as I got closer to their narratives, this question of moving into the private sector was at the time much more significant event than their initial contact with heroin. So that's the move of the first chapter, is to try to reorient the reader. These are workers who've been displaced in a particular way and share an orientation to the world, a sensibility, and also particular horizons. With that said, each subsequent chapter comes to define a different way that individuals or small groups came to live, define, move towards return to society. And let me now return to Resonances with Ting's project. I drifted a little bit. Three parts of overlap. I think that both of us are really interested in state-led development and temporality and what it means, sort of thinking about a pernicious discourse of development and developmentism. And I take this up in terms of the concept of historicity, which I define in 3 ways, but the key way here would be historicism and understanding a particular, as you were talking about, it's a particular understanding of teleology and moving toward touching up that is very, very common. And I think it appears in a lot of people's accounts. Yan Hairong is somebody who's especially explicit about how this development discourse codes the social landscape and makes particular forms of it. exploitation possible. So I'm struggling to try to understand how chapter 3 documents a group of people whose return is made, they argue there is no return. It's too late. They've sort of already given up and are living in this, the long-term horizon is a place that literally they won't go. And so to think about a form of sociality, a care that's premised around a shared narrative of understanding themselves as a sacrificial generation. A second place of resonance, sorry, I'll be quick, I've got 2 minutes, is we both, I think, are very interested in the possibilities of a critique of the present. And I didn't talk about it, but it's so beautiful. The way that the joking and the different critiques that you have, I think, are so powerful in helping us to understand the way that marginalization is internalized. In my work, there's a drop-in center that it's precisely this best practice. Video is known as a place that New York Times calls names it as this is HIV prevention, a form of state-led care in China is a model for all of China. This was before I got there in 2004. There's a ton of projects, a lot of money while I was there for caring for drug users. But it was precisely in that space where they've got this drop-in center protected from police that drug users, or sorry, recovering people, a range of different recovery trajectories are talking very specifically about Maoist forms of labor and the inadequacy of the particular response to their condition. And more, I could say more there. The last place that I think is really interesting, I love the way you were talking about ritual. And I thought this sort of the way in which ritual is recouped in drinking and how it sort of is being mobilized, but with an ambivalent and not fully complete, it can't be fully realized. For me, comes up in a chapter about a wedding where I am present in the wedding and I'm actually very involved and incredibly invested in this wedding. And at different moments, I'm realizing that the couple, both of whom are recovering heroin users, in the wedding have this double hope that it will do the work of ritual of marking them as a married couple, but also marking them as former drug users. And it's that while I'm in the wedding, I'm realizing that the work of ritual doesn't have the power and I think about sort of the history of ritual in anthropology, but also my own relationship to this public request. It's to so many people and their own struggling ontological realization that the moment of recognition that they want isn't the ontological function of an earlier moment of ritual can't work in the way that they hope, and what that means for their struggle. So I just wanted to stop there. It's your work is fantastic, and yeah, I really enjoyed thinking. Sorry. Saiba Varma will be next.
Thanks, Nick. Thank you all. I just want to thank Emily and Nick again for their absolutely like Herculean efforts in putting this together and connecting people all across the globe. I'm really honored to be here and to be in conversation with everyone on this panel. It's really one of the bright spots of the pandemic is that we can do this kind of stuff together. So I'll begin with some comments on Nick's book, and then I'll talk a little bit about my work. So it's my pleasure to offer some comments on Nick Bartlett's extraordinary book, Recovering History's Life and Labor After Heroin in Reform Era China. This book's sharp attunement to temporality, lived experience, and historicity open up new ways of approaching the anthropology of addiction. Rather than place the clinic in the foreground as a conventional medical anthropology text might, the book traverses the uneven terrain of addiction's aftermath in spaces of the everyday. In Nick's thoughtful portrayals of recovering addicts struggling to rebuild their lives after lost years in relationships, I found myself returning to Veena Das's work on the aftermath of political violence and what she describes as the descent into the ordinary as an effort to remake worlds. Afterlives of addiction dovetail with the afterlives of resource extraction in Jeju, a city and landscape hollowed out from years of intensive tin mining. As Nick beautifully describes in the introduction, quote, "What became clear to me from my time in Jeju was that in recent decades, the possible futures nurtured by the extraction of natural resources in this region had been rapidly shifting. The mountains, of course, were always there, but the careers and rhythms of living they supported were in a state of flux," end quote. People with histories of heroin use become the living embodiments of this state of flux. Their stories are shot through with moments of possibility, such as a beautifully described wedding scene that Nick offers in chapter 5, as well as constraint, as they try to reconstruct livable and dignified lives for themselves in post-socialist China. What emerges from Nick's careful ethnographic descriptions are how possibility and constraint are not set apart, but interwoven. Marriage is meant to separate past from present, but it introduces new vulnerabilities. Caring for sick relatives and children become sites of both ethical remaking, but also introduce new tensions into the household. In attending to the state of flux that is the afterlife of addiction, Nick's work raises broader questions about the nature of recovery. From other anthropologies of addiction, namely Angela Garcia's The Pastoral Clinic, which has already come up in this conversation, we know that chronicity-driven models of addiction, we know that in chronicity-driven models of addiction, recovery is asymptotic rather than a destination. Yet Nick's work offers a different perspective on the problem of recovery. His interlocutor's struggles are less about slipping back into heroin use and more about slipping back into what they call a normal person's life. His interlocutors have managed to kick their habits, or most of them have, but a sense of accomplishment still eludes many of them. Instead of staying clean, cure is found in re-entering society and finding secure employment against the backdrop of both stigma and political economic transformation. As we float uneasily along this journey of recovery, it is not relapse we encounter, but rather a haunting of the past. The past or history is never really past, as much as former drug users try desperately to shed it like an old skin. Heroin users are never able to fully escape the weight of their actions. Though detoxified, they find themselves now out of time. Having lost crucial years and opportunities, they struggle to inhabit their present in a world that resists their efforts to harmonize with it. And I think this is really key, is that it's not just they are struggling to inhabit, this new world, but the world is also struggling to kind of harmonize with them. Recovery here operates in a dual sense, not just in the biomedical sense of coming out of a state of dependency, but more significantly in a search for meaning. And here the second meaning of the word recovery becomes important, the sense that what is at stake here is the effort to regain possession or control of something lost or stolen. What has been lost might never be recoverable, but I also found myself wondering, and Nick kind of alluded to this a little bit in his comments too, I found myself wondering about what about drug use and experimentation, intoxication, and play itself might be worth recovering. The forced separation of past and present selves, addicted and non-addicted selves that biomedical and social models of recovery demand can be incredibly violent. I wondered about what aspects of addiction, what aspects of its pleasurable qualities might be lurking under the surface as unspoken desire, and how these may also be efforts at recovery rather than impediments to it. I was really struck and also really moved by Nick's complex and layered portrayals of people in this book, and really felt their kind of multidimensionality and their contradictions as they tried to transition and make space for a better life. Despite the somewhat questionable choices that some of his interlocutors make some of the times, I never felt that the book took a moralizing tone. Nick's doubts, concerns, and worries were very much on the surface in particular moments, something which I really appreciated. The book ends on a deeply reflective note, one in which Nick thinks through his own loss of friendships, people, and place. And the book itself emerges as an effort, though always incomplete, at recovery. Nick's powerful argument about the existential search for and the simultaneous impossibility of recovery offers a really helpful starting point for my comments on my own work. As in Nick's book, where an epidemic of heroin addiction haunts the residents of Geju, in Kashmir too, more than 60% of people suffer from the effects of psychological trauma that lasts lifetimes. An epidemic of trauma that is threaded with histories of state violence, occupation, insurgencies, and natural disasters. From holding the clinic in abeyance, as Nick's book does, my book situates psychiatric care at the intersection of clinical life, humanitarian intervention, militarism, and political disorder. Rather than see care as an antidote to violence, the book shows how care and violence become co-imbricated, physically, ontologically, and epistemologically at different scales. Much like other projects of imperialism, Indian rule over Kashmir has been characterized by a shrewd combination of humanitarian aid, which is always cast in this idiom of love and care, and repressive state violence, creating a terrain of governance that combines and recombines the biopolitical and necropolitical, calculation and nervousness, care and violence. In recent years, the Indian state has explicitly tried to therapeutize its 70-year occupation of Kashmir by using the language and tools of psychiatric and psychological care to produce a subjective transformation in the population away from pro-independence sentiments towards an acceptance and gratitude for Indian rule. Yet it was another scale of imbrication of medicine and militarism that caught me. As a medical anthropologist, I was trained to study the clinic and to contend with the history of occupation and state violence as the background or the context of my work. But as I began fieldwork, I noticed more and more how my efforts to study medicine, care, and psychiatry were undercut by the presence of militaristic and counterinsurgency logics inside the clinic. Words with clinical meaning, such as shock, which referred to electroconvulsive therapy or electroshock therapy, had uncanny resonances in that they also referred to systemic practices of torture, electric shock, used by the Indian state to suppress the pro-independence movement. These folded meanings deeply affected what could happen in the clinic. They tied the coercive quality of care to the violence of counterinsurgency. In this sense, militarism and violence did not simply operate as a context in which, then the clinic was sort of situated. Sometimes these imbrications were less obvious, more indirect, embodied, and difficult to discern. Curfews and strikes disrupted the flow of care and medication. Whispers of mistrust between doctors and patients, produced by histories of collaboration and intelligence gathering efforts by the Indian state, resulted in the making of new doubts and mistrust. Experiences of loss and livability in the personal subjective mirrored Kashmir's knotted colonial geopolitics, as people spoke of the impossibility of recovering from conditions that are themselves maddening, such as the occupation. Sites of care, medicine, and psychiatry then are not only exemplary sites to witness the effects of violence and militarism, but rather these spaces become generative of their own forms of harm. Like tea that has been steeped for too long, care under occupation acquires a bitterness, despite the best efforts of individual practitioners who struggle in constrained circumstances. Because of these imbrications with violence, unlike other ethnographies, this book does not call for more care in response to suffering. It views care rather as an ambiguous set of actions that are both necessary and confounding. In this sense, conditions in psychiatric hospitals are not posed as lapses or failures in Indian medical care, and neither is a sharp line drawn between forms of everyday care and institutional care. I endeavored rather to maintain an attention to care work as complex, creative survival work, and it's really beautiful to see the resonances with that across many of the works. The Occupied Clinic is at its heart a book about these efforts to care, about the intersubjective depths at which political repression inhabits lives and shapes the means by which people seek to overcome or heal from its damages. It is also deeply personal in that I bring these insights to bear on the discipline of anthropology and myself as an ethnographer. As the book unfolds, you find the ethnographer, me, succumbing to violence's hypnotizing rhythms and effects. Anthropology is not outside these dynamics, but rather taking a cue from Jean Favre-Sada's canonical work on bocage witchcraft. I question the ethnographer's position as participant observer. As Favre-Sada memorably describes, participant observation imagines a role in which the anthropologist is, quote, outside while imagining oneself completely inside, end quote. She instead offers the notion of being affected, in which the ethnographer foregrounds the intensities of the fieldwork experience, using feeling as an entry point to knowing. Being affected comes with risks, however, as she notes, quote, allowing oneself to be affected does, however, mean that one risks seeing one's intellectual project disintegrate, end quote. For me, being affected was an incredibly generative approach to not only think about how militarism permeates the practices of medicine and psychiatry, but also ethnography. There are many moments in the book when ethnography becomes absurd, inappropriate, or impossible. Sometimes ethnography's limits force me to embody a different politics of hearing, one that was open to poetry, disordered speech, art, and lamentation instead of conventional speech, a range of expression and meaning making that did not demand closure and allowed me to be present with the disordered meaning worlds of my interlocutors. In the book's conclusion, I offer a meditation on the notion of duty, a rather old-fashioned term compared to the much more sexy care, that's doing its rounds in anthropology. So this idea of duty as a mode of radical mutual vulnerability and obligation between ethnographers and our interlocutors that takes forward the idea of being affected as a method. And I was really happy to see Emily also reference the idea of duty in her work. It's like an amazing kind of coming together. Understanding fieldwork and our role as anthropologists as duty forces us to be affected by others by recognizing how others are affected by us. Rather than grounding anthropology in notions of the liberal, rational, and discerning subject, duty helps us consider in what ways we are bound to each other through relations of intimacy and mutual obligation beyond our control, as fraught as they might be. Duty, I suggest, might offer a way to build new futures and new modes of doing anthropology. So I will stop there and pass it along. It is my pleasure to pass the mic to our next speaker. Lyle Fernley is an assistant professor of anthropology at the Singapore University of Technology and Design.
Thank you, Saiba. So I will share, I just have a few images. You'll see during my talk why at least one of these was useful. So let's see. Okay, so my comments are titled Turning Care Inside Out, and the first part will be commenting on Saiba Varma's book, The Occupied Clinic, Militarism and Care in Kashmir, and then I will talk a bit about how that made me think through my own book. We begin by passing through the Kati Darwaza gate into Old Srinagar on foot now, walking past imperial debris before arriving at the clinic, the government psychiatric diseases hospital of Kashmir. Inside the clinic, psychiatrists listen, bored, overworked, sometimes with condescension, as patients narrate their illness. Many patients tell of a syndrome referred to as DAG, a restless pain, which the doctors translate as a somatization of psychological trauma, part of the epidemic of trauma that has accompanied decades of war and counterinsurgency in Kashmir. In these first pages of Saiba Varma's The Occupied Clinic, we appear to be on the stable ground of medical anthropology, a clinical encounter, medical semantics, an illness syndrome defined by a local cultural system. We almost begin to feel that familiar centrifugal force. We expect to move toward the outside of the clinic, where the particular history of military conflict and cultural frames will provide the hermeneutic context for understanding patient suffering, complementing the psychiatric diagnosis and pharmaceutical therapy with the meaning that makes things whole, that wraps the clinic in its careful embrace. But Varma soon realized she had everything inside out, she tells us. Her book could not be a story of medicine in violence. Rather, far more disconcertingly, it is a story of medicine through violence. Violence through medicine, sorry. Interesting turn there. So violence through medicine. The clinic is occupied. Here, counterinsurgency makes its most effective campaigns through infrastructures of care, such as the fact that the best substance abuse treatment center is located inside a police post, or the unstoppable transfers between the use of electric shock as a means of torture by the military and as a means of healing in psychiatry. Violence, militarization, and war are not only contexts around the clinic, they don't just shape, influence, affect, constrain, limit, or oppose the clinic and its work of care. Violence and war are inside the clinic, internal to care. Yet Varma's point is not by any means a reductive one, as if everything were at bottom violence, as if care is merely violence by other means, Hobbes in the clinic. Like other recent work contributing to the reimagination of care, she highlights the ambivalence of care. Medical therapy is neither independent from nor strictly instrumentalized by military occupation, but rather it is disturbed. And that's the title of one of her chapters where she focuses on this idea of disturbance. So to take one example of what that disturbance looks like, we can see how she kind of shows the remaking of the doctor-patient relationship, which becomes a setting of two-way mistrust that fragments politics and healing. And it both maybe want things out of this relationship, both care for the other person, but also totally mistrust the other, mistrust the doctor on the patient side and mistrust of the patient from the doctor's side. To understand this relationship of violence through medicine, occupation as care, we should dwell on the spatial diagram that Varma introduces, turning inside out. She draws this image from Annelies Ryle's book, The Network Inside Out. Riles was concerned above all, so Annelies Riles was concerned above all with the fact that, as she puts it, the insights of anthropological studies of globalization often seem oddly anticipated by the subjects of transnational ethnographic inquiry themselves. That is, the apparent outside of anthropology is actually already inside. And this, I had not remembered the Favre Sadat point that Saiba just mentioned, and that's a very interesting. So Annelies Riles is probably turning that comment from, sort of turning around that comment from Favre Sadat in this phrase. So an anthropology inside out for Riles is one which embraces the doubling of concepts like network, which are both part of our anthropological repertoire and part of our subject's own repertoire. So the result is an anthropology that's not a cultural translation, but rather something that could be perhaps called cultural topology. For Varma, Saiba Varma, this topological language offers a pathway to understanding, I would say, a different doubling than what Annelies Riles is working on. That is the ambivalence of care, this overlaps of war and medicine. To turn the clinic inside out means to address the occupied clinic not as a fork in the road, as if one could choose between medicine and violence and separate them, maybe in some sort of utopian or ideal future. So it's not to say that, but rather as a topology of a Klein bottle. So that's what this is. So a topological form. And so it's not either or, but both and. A Klein bottle, Giovanni da Cole writes in an essay on Marilyn Strathern's anthropology, has neither an inside nor an outside, or rather, depending on one's point of view, it is all inside or all outside and nothing else. Take any moment in Saiba Varma's book, and it is impossible to determine whether it is inside or outside the clinic, inside or outside the war. If you travel along the outside, you suddenly find yourself on what appeared to be the inside and vice versa. I found this topological image, the inside out, helpful reflecting on what I was trying to do in my own book, Virulent Zones, which is on the global health effort to contain disease pandemics at their hypothetical epicenter in China. Where Varma turns the clinic inside out, I tried to do the same with the laboratory, although I didn't ever use this term and I never cited, I didn't work through Anois Riles at all, but it's very useful to think it through, I think. Virulent Zones traces the global efforts to study and contain the emergence of viruses in China, a place long seen as the point of origin of influenza pandemics, as well as the source of SARS and, more recently, of course, the novel coronavirus that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. Global health programs to monitor viruses and contain pandemics have exhibit a particular geography. As historian Nick King describes it, the post-colonial economic periphery of developing nations are seen as the source of global pandemics, while global health programs oriented by a logic of containment are in essence designed to biomedically insulate wealthy countries from these emerging pathogens. So in some sense, global health as care for the wealthy parts of the world is premised on containment at the source, a containment that often necessitates incredibly violent interventions, especially on the bodies of animals through culling, but also through things like closures of markets, shutdowns, and many of the things that we've seen also in response to this pandemic. So a particular relationship between the global and the local developed, one that has been described as a geography of blame. Over and over, scientists in global laboratories, whether Australia, Hong Kong, United States, identified China as a viral hotspot because of its distinctive local ecologies of animal farming, live animal markets, wild animal consumption. Medical anthropologists have often decried this or criticized this geography of blame for ignoring the more complex economic, cultural, social, and political contexts in which these viruses emerge. As Arthur Kleinman and colleagues put it, for example, global discourses regarding the origin and spread of H5N1 avian influenza all too often consist of allegations of blame and assumptions of cultural shortcomings rather than serious investigation of the political, cultural, and socioeconomic realities of the societies that have come to be associated with the virus. However, when I began my fieldwork following global health scientists, primarily ones working with or collaborating with UN Food and Agriculture Organization, who had moved into China in order to work towards containing these flu viruses, I found that far from ignoring these contexts had actually become their primary object. They weren't especially interested in surveillance of viruses or sampling of viruses, but rather in what one researcher called the non-virological, migrations of wildlife species, farming techniques, rapid population growth trends, changes in livestock production, almost anything, I soon realized, could become part of the context of viral emergence, and therefore part of their ever-expanding research programs. As a result, their research did not center on the laboratory or in the laboratory, even if some of it took place inside laboratories, but rather in particular field sites in China, such as the Poignancy Lake, that were treated as experimental systems. It would not be correct to describe this as a substitution of field science for laboratory science because they continue to be interested in lab research and virological knowledge, nor would it be accurate, I think, to merely focus on hybrids and borderlands that emerge between lab and field. Instead, I argued in my book that the search for the pandemic epicenter involved the displacement of the laboratory as a model of scientific practice. So again, to think through that topological imagery, we could think of it as the laboratory turned inside out. This is the Poignancy Lake. Okay. Displacement in science and technology studies is a key concept, has been a key concept used to understand the distinctive pathway of scientific knowledge. So science, SES scholars have tried to show how science is not really rooted in revolutionary paradigm changes, nor in sort of linear discovery, but rather through these surprises and displacements. Yet the concept of displacement has tended to focus on the agency of the scientific expert and the laboratory as a model of scientific practice. For example, Bruno Latour's famous book, Pasteurization of France, shows how French bacteriologist Louis Pasteur's vaccine relied on the displacement of the laboratory, the movement of the laboratory into cattle farms where he conducted field experiments and tests, and then the subsequent transformation of the farm back into the laboratory. So laboratories create displacements through mastery of scale, as when Pasteur is able to recreate a cattle farm in miniature inside his lab in order to make the microbes visible. This change of scale, Latour writes, makes possible a reversal of the actor's strengths. Outside, animals, farmers, and veterinarians were weaker than the invisible anthrax bacillus. Inside Pasteur's lab, man becomes stronger than the bacillus, and as a corollary, the scientist in his lab gets the edge over the local, devoted, experienced veterinarian. So you see, this provides a certain image of the scientist going to the outside and coming back to the inside, and that's where the power of science comes from. In the end, as Latour puts the point most forcefully, for the world to become knowable, it must become a laboratory. But the scientists I observed were much less heroic than Pasteur, or at least Latour's rendering of Pasteur. Although they moved outside to farms and fields, they did not simply extract materials, bring them back to the lab, and declare victory. So I began to try to see another trajectory of scientific change that would not begin and end in the lab, but follow a centrifugal movement that continued to question the context of viral emergence, moving towards the outside. And one of the questions raised by this, I don't have time to go into, but is whether that might provide different relationships to care than in the earlier model that I was talking about. Ultimately, though, by the time they arrived at the hypothetical point of origin, the hypothetical epicenter of influenza pandemics, they found it had been displaced by their own movement. As Vincent, one of my interlocutors, reflected to me, so this is a pretty long quote, so I'm just going to read it out. We had this concept in HQ, or in our animal health program, that we need to tackle the disease at source. Countering the disease at source was really important. Where's the source? Where's the origin? And then at some stage, when you had such a kind of multifocal emergence of viruses, then you were wondering, what is a source? Where is a source? The epicenter, like the laboratory, was turned inside out. So I'm going to stop. I'll stop with that. And I would like to now pass on the baton to Emily Ohm, and whose book was also published this year, A Time of Lost Gods, Mediumship, Madness, and the Ghosts After Mao.
Thank you, Lyle, and thanks everyone for their really moving and engaging reading so far. It's actually really helpful to rehear all these rereadings, so I'm really happy for that. And so when I started reading Lyle's wonderful book, Virulent Zones, Animal Disease and Global Health at China's Pandemic Epicenter, I was immediately struck by a homology guiding our projects. In terms of, in spite of their apparent distance in themes, global pandemic prevention and spirit mediumship, which is usually rendered quote unquote local in the literature. But as Lyle so aptly put it in his book, the pandemic epicenter is not best understood as a local place. And I would say the same about mediumship. So the starting point in geography of thought, I feel like in both of our works might be described as something like, what is it to travel toward a troubled center and proclaimed origin? And what might we find by tracing the spatialization of troubles? And using Lyle's term via Kankiam, how might processes of displacement operate with respect to this figure of origin? And so I'll begin with some of the threads that drew me in Lyle's extremely rich, kind of careful and conceptually nuanced book, with apologies for overlaps with what he just said, probably better in his own words. So reading Lyle's book felt like reading a detective novel that's uncanny in its timeliness to our shared situation today, as he follows the travails of scientists across continents, trying to locate the origins of viral pandemics. The mytho-etymological origin of pandemic as disease begins with the late 19th century efforts to track the so-called Russian flu using then novel telegraph technologies from the Caucasus to Russia to Western Europe and then around the globe through colonial outposts in Africa and Asia. And so note the reverse directionality of the initial movement between metropole and colony compared to later imaginaries today. So such efforts of tracking would intensify with the establishment of the WHO after World War II, with propositions for a worldwide influenza surveillance program tethered to hopes for protection through timely vaccination. specifically to quote a set of WO meeting notes from the 40s, to protect countries yet unattacked. So tensions arose between national biosovereignty, to use Aiwa Ong's term, and global health ideals of a border-crossing transparency. But as Lyle notes, his project takes a somewhat different approach to space and sovereignty than dualities of national claims to sovereignty on the one end and normative claims to global health. In Lyle's work, the globe of global pandemics actually takes shapes through two forms of surveillance: the international stationing and networking of labs, and the microbiological discernment of antigen variations, where risks at the planetary scale become visible at the microscopic scale. And so here I'm bringing in the term discernment from mediumship, because there's also a question for the mediums I work with of what becomes perceivable at the global or cosmopolitical scale through discernment of spirits passing through the porous body. And yet again, the figure of the nation state also doesn't simply retreat and disappear between the microscope and the planet. By 1957, a dramatic new hypothesis, Lyle writes, was born. Quote, China could be the source of pandemic influenza viruses. And curiously, and perhaps not incidentally, this imputed spatial origin landed precisely at the vanishing point, to use the title of Lyle's conclusion, of that which didn't allow spatial access amid Cold War politics. So mainland China sat precisely outside of the WHO's surveillance network at the time, a black hole at the center of the map. So teams of international scientists would be pulled toward this black hole, yet be shut out of it, forced to orbit around its edges, Hong Kong, Thailand, Vietnam. And simultaneously, it seemed like an alternate world center, to quote Lyle, was being formed. While it remained inaccessible to certain outsiders, researchers from within the People's Republic were working in parallel and were among the first, in fact, to draw links between animal flus and human epidemiology. Questions arose there as to whether new viral variants were actually homegrown or imported. So while the world of scientists on one side of the Iron Curtain approached China as the untouchable pandemic epicenter, an alter world sat on the other side, itself the center of the virological rather than the viral. And so in thinking about alternate world centers, I think it's useful to bring in the notion of displacement, which provides, I think, both the narrative movement of Lyle's book, as well as one of the core arguments about the operations of science. Drawing on Canguilhem's concept of scientific ideology, Lyle shows ethnographically how scientists in search of that pandemic origin don't rigidly cling on to their scientific objects as we often imagine, nor are they merely self-certain heroic virus hunters as they may be portrayed. Instead, they move along their paths, and in this path, scientists are displaced again and again by the people, places, and things they encounter. To quote Canguilhem, scientific ideology does indeed stand over, and that's a play Lyle tells us on the word for superstition, over a site, stand over a site that will eventually be occupied by science. When science eventually supplants ideology, it is not in the site expected. And so in this, now in Lyle's words, scientific ideologies lay out a direction of inquiry, but the actual results of that inquiry are pushed in unexpected directions. So across the text, Lyle shows us how theories of a centralized, spatialized origins are actually quietly displaced again and again. The use of remote sensing displaced notions of a single epicenter by identifying numerous double-crossed cropped rice paddies thought to heighten the risk of viral transmission. And previous boundaries between wild and domestic birds were displaced by encounters with Chinese farmers who actually bred and cultivated quote unquote wild swan geese for traits of wildness. So internalizing the boundary of wildness and domestication into the body of the goose, rather than the space that the scientists had imagined, which was the boundary of human agricultural landscapes. So the center gets scattered and the lines of discernments shift. So at this moment, let me return for a moment to my own work, attempting to displace and reread it through Lyle's concepts. And there were other ideas around affinity and supplementarity that I really wanted to address, but couldn't quite fit in. And just wanted to touch on how I love Lyle's idea, thinking about Nick's work, Nick's read of Ting as well, that the work of drinking really does a lot to create, in fact, the infrastructure for the very possibility of access for science in the banquet table. So now turning to my work, my own work is in Hanan province, a heavily agricultural province in central China. whose landlocked position once conjured a grand sense of civilizational center, with agriculture and sedentary settlement precisely a source of civilizational pride. But now, after post-Mao market reforms that redirected the future toward coastal factory cities, such an inland, Nedi position conjures a sense of backwardness and abjection, a space out of time, a black hole at the center of the map. And so beyond the rural backwater worthy of philanthropic pity, Hanan is potent in the post-reform national imaginary as a source of charlatans and thieves. And urban friends and colleagues would try to dissuade me from going with a somewhat euphemistic term, 不好, not good. Those in Hanan itself would speak of its own poverty as a source of lie, of the amoral, unreliable, deceitful. And at the same time, I was also told by friends in the city that mediumship also didn't exist anymore in today's China, at least among the Han ethnic majority. And so my journey toward Hanan in search of mediumship in some ways mirrors Lyle's and Lyle's scientists in the sense, in their case, of an unreachable epicenter filled with a surplus potentiality of disease, and in my case, the sense of a hollowed center filled with a density of badness and a sensation of what's no longer there. And so such an abject rendering of a collapsed former center belies a curious interval between the civilizational origin and that of the landlocked left behind nowhere, an interval that the spirit mediums and villagers alike called the time when Chairman Mao reigned. And as I describe in the book, the figure of the peasantry really gathered a certain force throughout modern Chinese history, first as a new literary object of pity and concern, then as a sort of propelling force for the revolution to come. And at the time, with over 90% of its population in the countryside surrounded by urban-centered formulations of communist revolution, Mao refigured the Chinese peasantry as in fact the heart of the nation's suffering, and by extension, the heart of global class struggle. And so through these political campaigns involving oral storytelling practices throughout villages, suffering of the individual peasant body was telescoped across local, regional, national, and world historical scales, producing a cosmocratic mythologic, to use a term of David Apter and Tony Sage. So the fate of the peasantry was thus linked concentrically to the future of world history, as the Chinese village becomes metonymic of the planetary potential for equality. And to augment Lyle's phrasing then, the revolutionary epicenter is not best understood as a local place. And in this world historical time space, condensed in the Maoist village, the Maoist village then later becomes inverted once again in the post-reform era, as the rural and the peasantry were rendered sources of anachronism and stagnation in China's now marketized economy. And so amid this sense of chronotopic displacement, the mediums I met found themselves not just at the hollowed center, but in what Lyle might call an alternate world center. In the wake of Mao's death, they describe a landscape repopulated by demonic spirits and corrupted deities since market reforms. And Mao for them was not the secular figure of religious repression, as is so often portrayed in Western accounts, but rather a figure of divine sovereignty, sent from the heavens to save China from full foreign domination. And during Mao's reign, the mediums say, demonic spirits vanished in fear. With Mao's death, corrupted gods and ghosts swarmed back, mirroring and provoking human greed. And so in their rituals, the mediums work to discern between the virtuous and corrupt spirits, annihilating the corrupt. They keep their eyes toward a messianic horizon of what they call a true socialism to come, a time of true equality following an apocalyptic end of this world. The center of this new world would be none other than the true center of the virtuous world, Henan province. No longer the not there it appears as today. To partake in this otherworldly revolutionary work, the mediums undergo a spectral displacement, the displacement of their own body and soul by invisible occupying forces. Spirit possession in the post-Mao era is considered especially risky because the spirits themselves have become charlatans, so with the bad masquerading as the good, and you can't tell the difference anymore between a god and a ghost. So at the same time, one can't perceive and therefore can't get rid of corrupt spirits that care for the present without opening opening their own bodies up to these displacements of the spirits, which may provoke their own illness or even death. The mediums called this spiritual work, walking Chairman Mao's path. So in both Lyle's and I's texts, then there seems to be a pairing of displacement and what might be maybe termed determination with relation to a troubled space of origin, knowledge through displacement and a will to knowledge. And this brings me to, it reminded me of a recent comment by Christian Sirachi in a talk on anti-China politics in the US elections. He was reflecting on the role of China scholars. And to quote him, it doesn't matter how much we know unless something changes at the level of our desire. And so to something else he said another moment, what matters is not merely the production of knowledge per se, but the ways in which knowledge is inscribed in our own economies of desire. So I found myself left with a somewhat oversimplistic thought after walking through both our texts that it's not necessarily to be answered, but just something that came to mind was, to what extent is displacement necessarily or even usually a counterforce to centralization, given the gravitational pull of the black hole? If the allure of scientific ideology is that it stands in the place of a true future science to come, what exactly is the role of the displacement in this path? And in light of, I suppose this is in light of the more recent history, where I find myself wondering to what extent the desire for knowledge of China as pandemic epicenter and the desire of the figure of the heroic virus hunter or the vaccine inventor are, whether or not these are actually displaced by the very real travails encountered during the scientific process. And on my side, I think of the mediums, and I think of Hoon Song's writing on the sovereign face in North Korea, in which sovereign faciality lends itself to the historical gap and promise of a Marxist knowledge to come. And so both the displacements of the scientists and the displacement of the mediums in this sense don't quite lead them to abandon the search for a center, albeit a new center found to return to Kangyam may not be in the site expected. And so I'm gonna skip over something that I was gonna say because I just wanna actually return to, I realized that care really dropped out of my thinking on this. So, so moving across now from the beginning of Ting, of care as enacting life worlds while afflictions interrupt, and Nick talking about care and the figure of sacrifice, and Saiba on care and maybe shifting to duty and obligation as question. And Lyle's kind of notion of care premise on containment. And then again, Ting reflecting on Felicity's work, and this is Ting quoting Felicity, care as binding, as that which binds people as it sets them free. And so I think about whether or not these movements of displacement and re-centralization can be also thought in terms of what binds people as it sets them free. So on that note, I will turn it back to Felicity Elino and her take on how this resonates or not with her book, Rituals of Care, Karmic Politics in an Aging Thailand.
And sorry, Felicity, before you start,
Yes.
if it's okay, I will just say to those of you out there that after we finish, and really at any point, you can write questions, comments in the chat, and we'll turn to those when Felicity is done, or talk among ourselves as
the case may be. Right on. Okay, well, I love rounding out this panel talking about Emily Ng's book, A Time of Lost Gods, Mediumship, Madness, and the Ghost After Mao. I keep saying that this book is like a fine wine. I mean, really. And I'm just gonna savor a few parts of it here, just these few minutes. So let me jump right in. As Emily's just been talking, the book takes us to Hanan province, central China, depicted as the backward, externalized, internal other of urban China, with a founding observation that the spirit mediums there understand Mao as divinely sent. And his reign, unbeknownst to him, served to cast all the corrupt ghosts and deities out of China. So, as she writes, the quote, purportedly anti-religious campaigns of the socialist state for the mediums constitute cryptic acts of divine intervention, acts inaugurated by otherworldly forces that allow the earthly state to misrecognize itself as secular. And thus, for the mediums, the end of Mao's reign, and she's writing here, the advent of market reforms, did not mark a return of religion, but a return of spirits. corrupt, duplicitous. So in part, she's asking us to rethink Maoism, among other things, including madness. And in a way, this is like Lisa Stevenson asking us to rethink suicide. There's a terror in the proposition, given, say, the horror of the Cultural Revolution. And so in doing this, she presents us with a kind of, forgive me, a kind of morality of inscrutability. I don't know, as a placeholder term, I want to return to that notion in the end. So I want to touch on a few elements here, which help me to, how to say, like densify my own thinking about care in Thai contexts and across all these projects, really. And I think this book has ethical and practical implications for our shared interests in care and social change, as well as perhaps for anthropological analyses more generally. So the first thing I want to highlight is her concept of spectral or cosmic doubling. The term is a kind of shorthand, helping to bring attention to the, quote, potentiality for any seen and felt person, place, thing, or action to simultaneously host that which cannot be seen or felt. Things have significance in at least two realms simultaneously. So she's not making categorical claims with this term. She writes, as she says, quote, descriptively to convey rather than categorically to define. And indeed, she never denies the material or other various lines of inquiry or truth claims. She never rejects exactly standard dichotomies, such as the heavenly versus the earthly, the secular versus the religious, the real versus the fake, so on, these. Rather, she sustains through the whole book a reorientation, an invitation to see other tensions more central to her interlocutors. Let me just say, what a feat to sustain this through an entire book, given our strong academic habits that bolster, definitive divides. And, I found it even hard just to sustain it through, my talk. And so I also see the pull, the terrible pull, like to concretize. And I was thinking about the social body put forward as not something to concretize at all. And yet there's a tendency, to nail it down. So I guess what I want to underscore then is that the main logic she's bringing forth in this book is one of correspondences. She said, different from linear cause and effect, a sensibility of analogism, to use Descolat's phrase, rather than naturalism or animism. Now, the spectral or cosmic doubling also conveys the possibility for links across scales of time, which brings me to the second thing I want to put on the table, namely her description of the person. Ng approaches the person, again, not definitively, never definitively, but she approaches the person in part as a psychic corporeal host of a meeting of temporalities. And really, while all these books in this set have discussed temporality, she's taking on something like beyond the geological. These are non-human timescapes of spectral sovereign. Recall, to be a medium is to be, quote, capable of perceiving and rendering perceptible the unspeakable thing spectrally driving a given situation. Now, this role is generally met with reluctance, she reports, on the part of the to-be medium, in part because it represents a loss of self-sovereignty for the mediums. And yet, she shows that the coerced can be dignified. This is rather than an autonomy-centered approach to the subject. We have here as a given the, quote, always already non-sovereign status of the human and the state. Now, divinely driven here. So she returns to these old school cultural understandings of the self with this fundamental distribution of the person. And it's illustrated so beautifully, for instance, with the Hananese pronoun for the combined I, he, we, used with spirit mediums, and these harrowing scenes where her host mother kowtows on behalf of her husband, and indeed on behalf of a spectral mother and her son wrongly killed in another time. And she calls this a distant intimacy. And I just can't help but know that while anthropology has taken up the term subjectivity in response to what seemed like the apolitical renderings of cultural notions of the self, Emily is here first, refusing any ubiquity or constancy in these notions of the self. Like, they don't always use that pronoun, okay? But more, she's showing that these ideas are deeply political, beyond the mere earthly political concerns that we can render through social and historical analyses. So where I take up the critical phenomenology, she in part upends it. And like, for the earthly social training of awareness is also subject to cosmic collisions. And I look forward to exploring the ramifications and manifestations of that, which is drawn out in part in my work on karma, but there's more here. But I digress. Or do I? There's so much more to say, and I'm looking at the time. There's so much to say about history in this book. For instance, she writes, quote, "Something happened to narrativity during the Maoist era and during the Cultural Revolution in particular." Really, she does this genius unpacking of changes in the symbolic order, individual and collective. You got to see her stuff on the peasant, as she alluded to, and on class in particular. It's just extraordinary. And it's through her working and reworking of the symbolic order through the 20th century that she comes to show certain impossibilities of care in the present. In these scenes in the psychiatric hospital, as it sits across from the square where the mediums gather, she draws out how care registers and how it does not. And there's resonance between the distant intimacy she shows with the spectral and the earthly timescapes, and the temporary, awkward hospital intimacy of family members who are usually separated across vast distances thanks to this outmigration, now drawn together at bedsides. Yet with notions of reciprocation are, quote, discordant and at times illegible across generations. So her historical tracings show us how, quote, grammars of care lose their mutual intelligibility. It's such an injustice, not going further. I'm sorry, Emily, I'm flattening out all you've done here, reframing madness in these terms and so much more. But let me wrap up with care and corruption, a return to this corruption. So maybe in terms of care, the stark conclusion here from all these texts is that even in the most robust moral terms of our earthly social worlds, like forms of care are wrapped up in forms of violence and in disjunctures of time. What counts changes, and generations experience like an expulsion, or what counts also brings with it harms or repressions, or what counts can be cosmically overturned, or that care for the spectral realm can wreak havoc on human worlds. There's no recourse to the good offered here, though perhaps a deepened appreciation of how our fates are tied up together. But corruption, okay, I can't end without going back to the situation in Hanan as rendered by the mediums, a return of corrupted deities. I mean, even your old favorite gods, they're untrustworthy, maybe. It's like, and in the logic of this correspondence, damage is wrought by way of corruption itself. As Emily writes, quote, rather than a prime cause, this or otherworldly, the mediums describe the crossing of the human and non-human by the traveling attribute of corruption. This is a logic of mutual attraction and escalation. You mentioned the mirroring. It's both a way of sagely goodness and contagion. Okay, I'm going to venture one last quote, long quote. Here it is, quote, cosmological alignment of the past and present requires the true sage to endure the seemingly amoral effects of heaven's acts. The reign of wrongful rulers, the exceeding of normative dynastic cycles, the premature arrival of one's own death, all the while carrying on in moral cultivation without resentment. And further, rather than fake versus real, the emphasis or onus is on distinguishing the fake from the upright, she writes. And I here want to thank Lucila Carballo for drawing my attention to this notion of the upright, really like highlighting it. It's an attribute in this text. It's an attribute, a vantage that resists, I think, the pull of the cognitive. So what are we left with? We're left with like something like a Zen koan or something. Here we go, let me try it out. We inherit something like a desire to write from the vantage point of the good. And it's like, this is itself is an all or nothing proposition, the pure. Look, even when you're like being super cultural relatives, like you're decrying development time. Do you know what I'm saying? Like there's a pull to the good. And the scenes across the books and all of around us are nevertheless filled with impossibilities. And indeed, good one moment, and then from another vantage, not, or the script is flipped and blood is flowing. So what would it be like to try to decipher uprightness as part of our anthropology? The stakes may be high. For I think what I'm getting throughout these papers is that our analyses are world making, really. And we are shown here how like colludes with like. So how easily we could escalate corrupted tendencies through our work. Right? And dare I say the industry, just like capitalism, is fueled on this. Yet again, in the words of this medium who is also diagnosed with, quote, psychiatric disorder intimately related to culture, she says, no one can say for certain when it comes to these matters. It's not for us to know. So take that, anthropology. I'll leave you with that and look forward to discussion. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Felicity. That was a fantastic way to throw us into this discussion. So again, for those of you watching, please feel free. The way this works is you relay your questions in the chat, or your questions will be relayed to us through the chat. But while we're waiting for potential questions, does anybody want to start us off responding to it? It's really generative interminglings of the word.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So much.
I guess I just want to, selfishly, I want to ask Felicity what she meant by the feeling that my work would upend the sense of a critical phenomenology. Is it in the sense that what is visible or perceivable is at the heart of the phenomenological inquiry, and therefore the kind of the other dimensions are not fully always available to that form? Or
I think maybe in a way it's through the upending of habit. It's like, there's collisions that are possible. And in fact, I think that's helpful in sparking us to think about maybe Ting's question about change and interruptions. Like, yes, these habits are world making, but they're also change making, and so they're interrupted all the time. They're both doing and undoing at the same time, all the time. I mean, if you look on the streets of Bangkok right now, they're really undoing all the time. So I guess it's upending in the sense that if you want to concretize this notion of critical phenomenology and want to nail it down, the rug gets pulled out from under you. And I think that's the original intention, but it's like, again, the central, you go pull, coming back to concretizing, we're trained to do that all the time. What do you think of that?
I think, well, I can also open it up to others so that, but yeah, that was just really interesting. I didn't realize that you were thinking about the difference between habituation and collision, or the kind of interruption that Ting was talking about. And it just reminds me a lot of the work on event and kind of what is the role of interruption, or what is the role of that which cuts and then starts anew. And of course, that also inheriting a very post-Protestant or outright Protestant form of thinking transformation. And so how do we keep the both, because of course it's always there.
Yes.
And yeah, I don't know. And
yes, absolutely. And our friend Josh Brahinsky writes that what's a more powerful mode of social change, like a big event or a habituated pattern. And it's the habituation that is and yet they're not two. It's not an either or. I think this is
right.
But if I could respond briefly, I mean, I think it's so interesting. I mean, each of you in your own way, I think this question of interrupting our analyses, that I think, I mean, the way that all of you conceptualize this, Ting through this work of affliction, Saiba through Inside Out and this cultural topography and this really the occupation is care, and Lyle, this notion of containment and displacement, and then sorry, I slept 3 hours last night, so my ability to weave it all is not there. But in my own work, I think I stage this, I flatten and I do violence in every chapter, and I feel this. And as I was finishing writing the book, actually, I started having panic attacks about what I'd done. And precisely a particular form of critical phenomenology that allowed each chapter to be a theme. A person became a theme, and a person became a particular horizon. A person became a project that had a single commitment, and it allowed for a certain clarity. But it also, I was really unhappy with it, and actually the way that I broke it. So I did it, and I committed to it, and it's a certain form of care as violence was done by how the chapters unfold. But I was working on the manuscript, and I had a dream. And the dream was the last chapter. I had this figure who I was writing about was with me, and we were traveling in a train with a group, and I was speaking about his life and about other people, recovering people's life. And there was an audience of people watching us. And I was looking to him as I was providing the words for confirmation. And he, in the book, is the one who has the gift of speech like no one else. Anyway, he has a particular ability to fill a space and to, anyway, and he's silent. And I can't read his expression. And ultimately, I had that dream as I was trying to write the conclusion of the book. And so I sort of, this entire, whatever I was calling this critical phenomenological project, I end with the dream and then with the fact that I missed him, and that I didn't think the project could cohere. And so I built it up and then at the end kind of let it fall. And so that was my own very inadequate way of, I think, grappling with what I think you all in your own ways have integrated in, and you're disrupting and remaking your analyses in different ways. But I did it at the end, and out of severe, I don't know, a really hard period of writing.
I'm curious to respond to that, but I also want to read the question that came in through the chat. So from Dilara Balkan, I'm curious to know more about your research process, and as you guys were as you guys were information gathering, what types of questions you were asking yourself, and what questions were you asking your work? And then in what ways were you guys pushing back or exploring more during the information gathering stage? How did you find your topic focus as you were doing your fieldwork?
I guess I'll say something to that, which is I went to study end-of-life care. Went to study the end-of-life care movement, palliative care movement, and this amazing group of this kind of interlacing of coming together of palliative care practitioners, engaged Buddhists and social change activists who were putting death at the forefront of these social change efforts. So I was going like with the understanding of like, what is care universal? What does it look like for care at the end of life? And how has death become this movement? And I got there and I showed up, and as many anthropologists report, I'm working with people and they're not seeming to work in the ways that I had been trained by the palliative care literature, the Thai palliative care literature, to expect. They weren't using these terms. They seemed to be carrying in a different register that pulled me. It seemed worth noting by looking. And I guess I say that mainly to highlight ethnography remains one of these methods that when you miss it and your questions are off, that you change. And that's actually a lot of the information that a lot of the insight that you gain through the whoops and the oof and the humiliations and the et cetera, getting it wrong and being vexed and curious about others.
No pressure, Ting, but I think you have this is something that I really wanted to engage that is so interesting in your work.
Thanks. Yeah, I have lots of thoughts, and I feel that this panel has really helped me kind of think through, like, I think a lot of it was, as Saiba talked about, kind of a felt experience for me. It was very like, yeah, it began kind of feeling your way through what's the Maui saying again, like touching your stone as you go and cross the river or something. And
Nice.
and I think like you talked about the sojourner anthropology, and I think that kind of began as a Chinese Malaysian and kind of where to go next, and after college, and it kind of ended up in this region that kind of somehow paralleled the region that I grew up in, and that kind of stumbling along and finding things along the way. And so, sorry, that's a long way to begin how the journey began in Yunnan. But for the questions and the research, I think kind of what everybody's talking about, this process of displacement, seems to be very apt, because I think you go into you kind of experiencing this journey always with expectations, always with assumptions, and carrying it with you, and then having it constantly subverted as you're living with people. And for me, the first encounter began working in a clinic in a mental health institution. And then kind of, I think what Saiba was talking about and what Lyle talks about, everybody talked about, really was really helpful to think through what happened in that moment, because the clinic seemed to be in like symptomatic or the situation outside was kind of unfolding within the clinic. But then so much of what was happening in the clinic was already categorized. So this clinic was run by Christian NGO workers, and it was constantly labeling what the Lisu people were experiencing. And so the process was trying to get out of that clinic was part of this process of the foundations of these projects. So I think a lot of my work, when I talk about chronic pain and alcoholism, I in fact kind of try to not use the word alcoholism, because as you get out of the clinic, these labels don't really apply anymore. And yet they still struggle with these experiences of pain and alcoholism and madness, but through very different labels. And so I think that was kind of the question that I wanted to carry with me from the beginning with this research, which is what kind of questions I should be asking to create more openings and listening to indigenous theories or indigenous conceptions or misconceptions, I don't know. And now what I'm carrying with me, I think what was really helpful in this discussion is to think about this duty, questions about duty and forms of caring, because working with indigenous communities, I think that's a very important question about what does a decolonizing methodology look like in authoritarian Asia. And I guess one of my questions that I'm carrying with me right now is duty and responsibility and witnessing But at the same time, as we've talked about, this witnessing there's so many doubling effects. And so where does the responsibility lie, and how can we think about engagement beyond care, and what does duty look like, what does responsibility look like, what does uprightness look like? I don't know, that's kind of a very long response, and I'm not sure if I'm doing justice, and I should leave space for others too.
I think that was really beautifully captured. I just wanted to build on some of the things that you said as well, Ting, in response to this question, which was one of the questions I kind of went in to field work with. I was told that, this is the question that you can ask at any time of any person, which was just like, what are people making? But I, very quickly realized that this idea of what people were making, right, some idea of care or some idea of relationality was, right, again, impossible for me to actually access directly. It was always, I had to always access it in a kind of, through its displacement, right, to kind of connect to one of the themes that's been coming up. So through the disruption of particular forms of relations, through the disruption of particular forms of care, that's how, that question always kind of became visible to me. And of course, that's not something I knew when I was in the field. I knew it on a kind of subconscious level, but, field work is such an out of body, it's both like deeply embodied and yet out of body at the same time experience. So you don't really understand that is what's going on. But now, sort of reflecting so much later, I can kind of see that it was always through that deferment or displacement. And so also I wanted to kind of highlight in this question about information gathering that it was mostly about unraveling, unlearning your expectations, unraveling what you know about a particular space, or what you think you know about a particular space. And I was really struck with Emily's idea of spectral doubling, because that was something that was so clear to me working in a very militarized space, was that, I would have these encounters with people that were on the surface seemed one way, and then I would go home and I would talk to someone, I met so-and-so, and they'd be like, so-and-so is actually, works for this government, or is actually this kind of person, and you have no idea, you actually missed the whole encounter. And so Emily, I really like your idea of kind of using like this idea of spectral doubling, right? Because then as anthropologists, you're like, I'm never going to be able to access that knowledge. That is like a lifetime of embodied learning about a space, that I'm never going to know these multiple histories of people in this way, right? So it left me in a situation where these like doubts and these feelings of not knowing were so much on the surface, so I kind of began thinking about ethnography as a kind of unraveling, sort of what you were talking about, Nick, as well, rather than this kind of accumulation of knowledge.
I don't know if this is a little bit of a tangent, but the spectral doubling was really resonated with me as well, because in the New River Valley, it's actually like the landmark is physically doubled. You have the East Mountain and the West Mountain. You have the upriver and the downriver. You have the uphill and the downhill. And so when people are speaking, they're constantly talking in comparison, and it was very unraveling. Was part of the process of unraveling for me was unraveling my sense of direction, because I'll be like, where do I go to the village? How do I go to somewhere? And they'll be like, you have to go in relation to the city is past the river and above the sea. And you're like, well, I can you just tell me, is it left or right of the building? And that's just not the way the direction works. So Yeah, and at times it became dangerous because when you're carrying a heavy load of firewood on your back and there's like 10 people behind you, like if you go the wrong direction, it could be really dangerous. So the spectral doubling was physically dangerous.
Lyle, do you want to take up this question, or do you want to push her somewhere else?
I guess I'll just quickly say something about just how my field work was very displaced also in the process. I mean, I intended to study something about China as the pandemic epicenter, but I had intended to study a sort of in a public health, like a urban public health office, which turns out to be actually the topic of Catherine Mason's book, which many of you might know is an excellent book. So that is sort of originally how I conceptualized, but then I had a lot of trouble getting access when I returned after an early visit, and then I returned and I was not kind of accepted back. They'd moved the office from one district of Beijing to an outskirts area, and it was a completely new building, and the whole environment was very different. So at that point, I sort of moved to this other direction, which was more about animals and rural areas. But yeah, so that was sort of the trajectory, I guess. Maybe something I found Emily's question, or at the end, and I think it was also coming up in Felicity's comments as well, which is about the possibility that there's this, even when we're trying not to sort of recoup the kind of the good or something, but in the end, even when I'm talking about this idea of kind of another kind of science that's oriented towards displacement, but in some ways am I actually just recouping that? And that's, or is it end up being re-centralized, as you were saying, Emily? And yeah, I think that's quite an interesting, I mean, especially with what's happened after I mostly wrote this, except for the final sort of postscript of the book. There's been a lot of demands on me to comment about this situation and even to work towards some other kind of collaborations or things like that. So there are these paths that are opening up, which are also for me a question about what is the kind of critique that I'm doing, or whether there's some other kinds of engagements. So I think it's definitely something that's a concern for me. So.
Could I ask you just a little about that? And that my point wasn't at all necessarily a critique of your approach, but more of a sense, precisely in this moment, not that you were saying that the scientists were XYZ, but more that there are these forces that may be stronger than the displacements at hand. So that was a separate kind of question. But I guess I'm curious now that it's been a while since you've been invited as, unwantedly invited maybe as commentator and as a kind of duty and obligation to this role to speak on this, whether or not that has changed any of your relationships with your work in the book. Because I know there's a postscript, but now there's even, there's been a stretch of time since even then, so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really comes down to the question of sort of whether I want to push this, what I see. So one of the things that what I was seeing in the field work was this turn towards the outside, or turn towards the context among the scientists themselves. And especially one of the things that has been interesting to me about this is, so that was happening in the case of avian influenza, and the situation there is that it had become an animal disease, and it was endemic in the farms in Southeast Asia and China. And so it became a veterinary problem, and there was a whole different kind of set of engagements that this idea of containment was developing because of that. And so with the case of coronaviruses, which they had the same kind of virological knowledge, the same predictions, literally publishing papers in 2018 saying this is, there's 20 bad coronaviruses we've isolated in China. This is a concern, but there was no engagement at the level of this kind of into the context of emergence. It was much more centered around virology. So this is where but I feel that I'm not saying that you were critiquing me, but I'm just saying that I think it's a very good provocation, which is that I'm tempted to say, sort of valorize this other approach, but maybe there's some risks to that in terms of what role I should be playing. So.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? Especially like I was thinking of Kate Mason's recent piece in Cultural Anthro. Did you see this? Where she was like, yeah, I went, and she was making some comments before the pandemic really entered its phase in March, saying like, this is not the big one. And then she was like,
she wrote an op-ed, right? In January, actually, I think it was. Yeah, in the LA Times.
In the LA Times.
Yeah.
A letter to, yeah, exactly. And then she wrote I got that wrong. and it's like beautiful, but I mean, I guess it's sort of the fear that, wow, you would have of like, do I step and say something, and would I?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what is the level of my knowledge, or yeah, and also so much of this has been about prediction, right? About these prediction of the pandemics and how to, but so what are the limits of that also? Yeah.
It's also interesting, I mean, in the sense that all of us have these books that we have had in close to us for so long that now, or book and dissertation that are now out in the world. I mean, to me, the question of demands, it's also a new stage and new forms of relationships to the work where it's just beginning to, I guess it's unknown. So that's also, yeah, it's a particular moment that maybe we share a certain relationship to letting go. I had a friend first person who said, oh, I read it, who I know, who told me this a week or two ago, and my instant reaction was, how can I go back? Like, what should I horizon? Like that. So this is a different mode of allowing it to live its own life. So actually, we are over time right now. Does anybody want to offer any concluding remarks? Thank you for everybody who's joined us, but I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but I want to leave it open. Emily?
I thought you didn't want to put anyone on the spot. Well, I just want to thank everyone for coming, and you all for being here and writing what you wrote. I think it's just, I've just myself been trying to, I suppose, trying to slow down and read more slowly, even though there's an impossibility of that demand, because time seems to speed up and slow down at the same time in this kind of moment. And so it's been really nice to be able to sit with some of these texts and hopefully revisit them across time as a way to actually try to, think our world, not just kind of approach them as academic texts. So that's at least my hope and duty to the texts themselves. And so thank you, everyone. And yeah, see you out there.